everyone, and welcome to another episode of Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. It's been 100 days of the Trump administration, and we wanted to get on a few different scholars to ask some questions and get a little roundtable. So we'll have each of our scholars introduce themselves, and then we'll get off to the questions.
My name is Holly Vradenburgh. Thanks for asking me to be on the podcast again. I always enjoyed this. My day job is as a criminal litigator, but I'm also an instructor in constitutional law in the politics department at the University of Virginia.
My name is Paul Miller. I'm a professor at Georgetown University. I teach international affairs.
My name is Matthew Young. I'm an assistant professor at Elon University, where I teach political theory and constitutional law, and I'm thrilled to be with you.
Best-ish accomplishments of Trump's first 100 days, or his administration at the very least.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this question, and I'm not a policy wonk. I would love to be. It's a hobby, but I don't think my policy opinions are very strong. So the first thought that came to mind was actually the strikes on the Houthis in Yemen, who've been, obstructing passage through the Red Sea, and it kind of got eclipsed by Signalgate. But I think there was kind of an international consensus that that's something that needed to be done. But again, I'm not an expert in military affairs or international law. More in my lane, I was thinking about some of the litigation as to unitary executive theory, the president's powers to appoint and fire executive officers. And, there's some kind of new terrain that's being plowed there in terms of Trump firing members of boards who have for-cause removal protections. But honestly, I think he's probably kind of acting with the Supreme Court there. Whether or not we agree with the end result, that's kind of been the direction that they're heading in. So that's, some of the litigation that he's probably on the strongest round there.
Yeah, so it's hard to talk about Trump's achievements. I think so many of the things that perhaps people agree with, I can't count as achievements. His executive orders, perhaps some of them are good, but they'll be undone very quickly. So I can't count them as achievements. They're just pieces of paper that will hold for a couple of years and then they'll be gone. If I'm looking for an achievement, many of the things that he's done are also mixed with a bad rollout or bad staff work. I think there's some logic to the trade war with China, not with the global tariffs, but with the trade war with China. And we got to give Trump credit for this going all the way back to 2018. He did start to change the conversation about China in a healthy way that Biden sustained, and so I'm glad we're doing what we're doing. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, like the others, I have some skepticisms, but we're on the best part. One thing, I don't know if this is the best, but is something I think is optimistic, is or a couple of wins in international relations. One that stands out is addressing the sort of network through which Iran is shipping oil to China, to other places, and to try and give a little more force to those sanctions. I think that's a positive. I also think, there's positives in terms of how we got there is a different debate, but in terms of getting some concessions from both Canada and Mexico for trying to crack down on fentanyl. This is a big issue, and the opioid epidemic is sort of near and dear to my heart. So those are things that I look at as solid wins.
Worst-ish achievements of the last 100 days. We'll go right back through. Holly?
Kind of hard to pick. I think as a lawyer, I'm going to go with the executive orders targeting law firms. In terms of just a shattering of norms and healthy institutions and the functioning of the rule of law, it was just appalling in every way. And then to see the market forces and other reasons why some of the law firms have capitulated, we'll see what that really means and whether that will last. But it's been very disheartening to me as a lawyer, and really shockingly unconstitutional, targeted action on the part of the executive. I really can't think of an analogy in American history to that.
Yeah, so I'm going to cheat and pick one domestic, one international. The international example is the way that Trump talks about the war in Ukraine, where he's pretty clearly blamed Ukraine for being invaded and blamed Ukraine for fighting back, and really tried to paper things over and hand Russia most of a victory. That's a symbol of the kind of international era we're entering, and it's all bad. This is the end of essentially of the free world as we know it. It's rewinding the geopolitical clock to 1939. I just don't have words enough to describe how bad this is. Domestically, I'm going to agree with Holly. I'm going to pick a different event to symbolize the same phenomenon, and that's the pardoning of the J6 attackers. I'm going to say attackers, not rioters, because I think it was an attack on American democracy. And when you pardon people who are convicted of violent crime, this includes 400 people who beat law enforcement officers, you're creating a culture of impunity, saying that my side is above the law. And Trump is doing that with all kinds of things, including executive orders that Holly mentioned. He's doing it with his expansive pushing outwards of executive power. But I think that the pardoning was the most clear representation of his intent to hold his side above the law. And I know people don't like to use the F word, but there is a dictionary definition of the word fascism. And when you're communicating that political violence done for my tribe is okay, that's pretty close to fascism.
I actually interviewed Paul about him working through this, so I will drop that in the show notes if anyone wants to really tangle with a good explanation of fascism and within and by Trump.
Yeah, to me, I'm also going to sort of cheat. I'm going to say something about a tendency I see in this Trump administration, and then an example of this. And the tendency is this sort of act first and then figure it out later. And I can talk more about this a little bit later, maybe, but it's not a good way to do public policy. And we saw this with the letter that they sent to Harvard, and the administration says, "Oh, like this was sent as a mistake. Like we weren't ready to send it." And it's like, okay, if you plan on having a confrontation or deliver an ultimatum, you should plan to send the ultimatum, and everyone should be on the same page that we are like trying to deliver a confrontation. And we see the same thing in this case with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, where the administration admits that they were mistaken in deporting him to El Salvador, and then is unwilling to rectify that mistake. And it's this very strange tendency to like move fast, make a mistake, and then to decide that like holding on to that mistake is the strategy to pursue. I think that's actually robbed the administration of some real opportunities to make effective public policy, or to make movements that their supporters want, that might even be broadly popular. Deporting someone under circumstances that you concede were a mistake, and then defying courts over it. And I think this is a big problem. I think it's a due process problem. I think it ushers in even greater antagonism between the judiciary and the administration. And that's just a really bad start for your first 100 days.
And now, a word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Robin Hurst of Fora Travel. Robin is a former winemaker here in Charlottesville and would like to take the stress out of planning and customize your next planned adventure. Robin is a top-notch, detail-oriented planner. Having personally traveled to 25 countries and 33 states, she believes in building balanced itineraries that blend luxury and relaxation with adventure and exploration. She wants to hear what you're looking for and offers customer care that is easy and special. Robin does not charge a booking fee for hotels, cruises, nor tours. She has a tiered pay scale that she works with clients depending on what they need. For more information about Robin, please see the details in our show notes. And now, back to the show. Holly, Trump's most controversial EO probably is the end of birthright citizenship. How likely is that to be struck down by SCOTUS, and in what measure?
I'll give answering that my best shot. Before I do that, if I can just make like a bigger picture comment about EOs. We're here at 100 days, and kind of this tradition of marking administrations at 100 days dates back, I think, to FDR. And even then, it was an achievement of Congress's first 100 days, because FDR had passed, I think, 5 pieces of major legislation or something in the 100 days. So here we are, 100 days in, with 0 pieces of major.
FDR also called back Congress to do
Yeah,
that. Congress
that's
was not
right.
even in session,
Yeah,
so he not only said come back, he also was able to pass laws.
yeah. There was a very energetic cooperation between FDR and Congress. And here we are, 100 days in, and we have 0 major pieces of congressional legislation. And we have, well, I guess there was some budget dealings there, but like in terms of really substantive legislation, but we have something like 142 executive orders. And they're so kind of caught up in the courts, and some of them are enjoined, and some of them aren't, and some of them are contradictory, and some of them are just proclamations. And so it's really kind of hard. We know this has been a very active administration, but I think I agree with Paul's earlier point when he was just saying it's a little bit hard to get a feel for what's actually happening thus far, because it's all been this kind of robust, kind of messy executive power, and not legislative. But as to one of those EOs, the early EO striking down or ending birthright citizenship, so there are 2 problems with it, and one is that it was done by executive action. Congress has passed a lot of legislation, and immigration and naturalization, constitutionally speaking, is entrusted to Congress. And I think it's fair to say that Congress has presumed and built upon theories of birthright citizenship that the Supreme Court has previously recognized. So, there's the question of, can a president change by executive order what is in congressional statutes? No, he can't. So that's one way of going at it. You can't do that by executive order. And I think on that, you'll probably get a unanimous Supreme Court if they answer that question directly. As to the constitutional issue, it's really interesting to see the debate that's kind of risen recently, because, when I was in law school, I didn't think there were any contrary views about birthright citizenship. It was, you learn the 14th Amendment, you learn Juan Kim Art case, and it's just was accepted by everyone that I heard from, that this was the theory of citizenship that is unique to America, not fully unique, but intentionally unique, and has been embraced over the decades. There has been some scholarship that has come up recently trying to articulate a kind of protectionism for allegiance theory and invaders theory that would give some academic support to Trump's theory of the 14th Amendment, if not his executive order. I don't think it's likely to be successful at the Supreme Court, but I'm not quite willing to put a number on it in terms of whether or not some of the more conservative scholars will be influenced by that. I don't think so. I think it's going to be pretty overwhelming. The bigger question probably is if this question is going to come up to the Supreme Court. I think it's notable that the appeal that is currently set for oral argument at the Supreme Court regarding this executive order is only, at least the question that the Trump administration asked the court to review, is only about this question of nationwide injunctions, whether a federal district court can enjoin the executive order nationwide. They didn't ask for a review on the underlying merits. Perhaps it's because they kind of know that this was a little bit more of a publicity stunt than a legal argument, and that it's very unlikely to be successful at the Supreme Court. So we'll see.
Yeah, I asked because not only does Trump already have 3 appointees, it's a conservative leaning court, and I've seen in more liberal outlets, people are kind of screaming it'll be a 6-3 and Trump will be handed the presidency. I think that's a high misread of the court, especially the Roberts court, who Roberts going in and has very much tried to have as much 9-0s as possible. I agree with you. I think if it is on the merits, it's probably 9-0. I could see a 7-2 with Alito and Thomas just dissenting because kind of they want to, but I would hope Roberts looks for some sort of consensus around this, especially with a president just EOing the Constitution seems pretty egregious on both sides.
Yeah, if Roberts and Alito are in dissent, as you say, and I agree that they're the most likely, I don't think it's on the merit. I think it's kind of like what we've seen recently, where they think there's some procedural problem, or we shouldn't have taken it this way, or we were too hasty, or something like that. I have a hard time seeing even them just being like, "Yep, this is the correct reading of the Constitution, and yep, the president can do it by executive order."
Paul, how is this administration's chaos in this first 100 days different from 1.0? I think the public might somewhat remember the first administration of Trump being almost like an ambiguous chaos, like he just didn't know what he was doing. And you had a lot of people leaving, General Mattis and even his attorney general. But now this seems to be a much more almost kind of focused chaos. Is that correct? Or is this just Trump trying to play dictator?
So the first time around, a lot of Trump's appointees tried to constrain his instincts. His appointees, some of them were more experienced and knowledgeable in government, like the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, like his chief of staff, like the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, and they tried to impose some kind of normalcy, and there was this tug of war between their normalcy and Trump's instincts, and a lot of the chaos came out of that. And there were some other appointees like Steve Bannon, who was on the NSC staff for a while, and Steve Miller, who were deliberately trying to kind of foment the chaos. And so you saw that tug of war, and that was a big mess. And so the first 2 years, there was a lot of policy paralysis. I think you saw in the last 2 years of Trump's first term, it was more focused because Trump fired all those other people, and he got to drive the train more. It was also when we saw the Doha agreement with the Taliban and Afghanistan fell apart, and other things. This time around, from the get-go, Trump has ensured personal loyalty from everybody. And so there's nobody trying to constrain Trump. So the chaos, it's all his, and it's by design and by incompetence. By design, because some people want to flood the zone, to overwhelm the media, overwhelm the opposition with the sheer volume and speed with which they're doing things. Also, they're doing bad staff work. As I think, Matthew, you were getting at this about the move fast and break stuff, right? This is the Silicon Valley kind of mantra. They're doing things really, really fast, which is why they're so easily challengeable in court. It turns out that policy is hard, and it takes a lot of painstaking detail work. I worked in the White House for 2 presidents, and it was really hard to get stuff done because you had to cross your T's and dot your I's. And this administration isn't doing that. And that's why a lot of their policies will fail in court. Then they're going to have to go back and do it all over again. But this time around, they have a more focused team to do that.
Focused and yet still sending draft emails or accidentally sending emails. Do you think part of that chaos is not only because you have a lot of people who are just doing what they're told, but also because, I mean, the mass amount of firings and layoffs just is just a brain drain. So is that also confounding variable as well?
Yes, and the young people who are running Doge, who have no government experience whatsoever, I don't think they know what they're doing. They're very smart people who know how to program an AI and run a Silicon Valley startup. Government is a very different thing. It just is. There's this mantra for 30 or 40 years that we need to run government like a business. That's a really bad idea. Government and business are different things, and you need a different skill set and a different mindset to run a public institution for public benefit. So we're seeing a whole lot of things collide here to make government grind to a halt.
Matthew, is Trump a conservative at all at this point? I mean, I ask in a much more general way, conservative in, I guess, maybe Reaganite or even the William F. Buckley Jr. sense that has defined the American political right for the last 70 years or so. So is Trump a conservative? Trump is definitely a Republican because he has a Republican next to his name, but is he a conservative?
No. That's my short answer. The long answer, if someone asserted to me that Trump was a conservative, I would just ask, in what sense? He's not particularly a fiscal conservative. He's not particularly on the left fiscally either. We see language about efficiency, language about decreasing regulation, language about decreasing the size of government, but we also see things like these tariff policies that are not historically, at least in the last 70 years, part of the conservative tradition in the United States, and the skepticism about free trade. These are conversations I'm interested in having, but it's certainly not like, it's not 1980s National Review conservatism for sure. And in the same sense, is he conservative on social issues? I don't think so. I think he sees opportunistically some of the things like transgender athletes and women's sports as easy issues to win on. There are positions that are widely popular on some of these issues, but in the same sense, opportunistically, we've seen him sort of increasingly back away from a pro-life position. And not in the first term, he phrased it usually exclusively as or explicitly as, let's leave it up to the states. But we actually saw that that wasn't the case in his confrontation with Ron DeSantis and the way he's talked or campaigned around states having stricter restrictions on abortion. So I don't think he's a conservative in a fiscal sense or in a social sense, at least in what conservatism has meant in the last few decades in the United States. More broadly, I could ask, well, is he dispositionally a conservative? And I think the answer there is even harsher. He's not dispositionally a conservative. You think about the sort of greats in the conservative tradition. Roger Scruton says that conservatism is this sense that you can tear down in a half an hour or an hour what took generations to build, that good things are difficult to build and easy to destroy. You go back to Burke and a gradual progression, or Michael Oakeshott and this idea that the state is sort of like a ship, and the conservative politician is the one who carefully steers the ship. We don't know where the destination is, but we avoid swamping ourselves. We avoid rapid deviations where we could get lost. And Trump's just fundamentally not a conservative in that sense. And again, I alluded to it earlier, Paul said it. We see this in the Silicon Valley mantra of move fast and break things. That is not a conservative way to run a nation. That's distinctly anti-conservative. Burke would say move slowly and don't break things. Chesterton says, before you tear down a fence, you should probably have a good idea why the fence is there to begin with. And we've seen this with Doge, with a bunch of these other cases, that it's like, oh, let's cancel this spending, and then if it turns out that breaks something, we can go back and we can restore it. Oftentimes, it's difficult to restore the things you tear down. It's difficult to correct course back to the original course after these deviations.
Cville Handyman Services offers friendly, dependable help with a wide variety of small to moderate home repairs and improvements at a rate of $45 an hour. Every task is handled with care and attention to detail, and all customers receive personally written summary by email of all work performed, including any extra notes or suggestions that may be helpful. Whenever you need a hand, contact Chris to discuss your needs and set up an appointment. You can be reached by phone or email in the contact notes below. Thanks, and now back to the show. Paul, the broad political left is accusing Trump of having the U.S. slide into authoritarian rule. We're seeing actually more and more democracies slide that way. Is this a true fear here in the U.S. that we should be concerned about? And if not, why is it different than places like Hungary or Russia?
Well, I mean, we should always be concerned about that. As I think Jefferson said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So let's be vigilant about it. I wrote this thing in the Dispatch a while ago, trying to anticipate the stuff that Trump would do that might be authoritarian adjacent, straight up authoritarian, and then just outright fascist, right? And there's some things that he's doing that could be interpreted as a step towards authoritarianism, and maybe some things that are a bit further along the line, right? So, for example, he's talking about the Schedule F. It's a way of classifying federal workers as at-will political appointees rather than protected by the Civil Service Act. That's not necessarily authoritarian. It could be, because it gives the president a huge amount of power over federal workers. Might not be a bad idea for the president to be able to act with more efficiency across the executive branch. Again, having worked for two presidents, I think the president does need a bit more authority to unify the executive branch. But we can all see how that could be easily abused by a president who's not intending well. So that's where we got to be careful. We got to be vigilant to see how Trump is using that kind of power. The broader kind of assault on the rule of law is what troubles me the most. I think that you see this culture of impunity within the Trump White House. Think about I think we're calling it Signal Gate now, right? Where the National Security Advisor, whom I used to work with 15 years ago, hosted classified meetings over an unclassified network. That is violation of law. Past administrations have punished officials for that. Bill Clinton's National Security Advisor lost his law license, lost his security clearance for a pretty similar infraction. David Petraeus, right? And then Hillary Clinton's, email gate, right? All the conservatives were up in arms about that. So it's a bad thing when you're not careful with classified information. There's precedent for punishing high officials, and yet nobody's being punished. They're getting away with it. Donald Trump and his administration have a culture of impunity about the rule of law. That's definitely a step towards authoritarianism. It really is.
And along with Congress, the Republicans in Congress blocking an investigation of PTAC stuff. Like, I have worked with classified documents. I was a DoD contractor right out of college. Very clear, if I brought anything out of the SCIF, I would be 5 years in federal prison. Pretty much no questions asked.
And so that kind of impunity is a step towards authoritarianism. And then the most egregious thing, it'd be terrible if I didn't mention this. Look, I worked as a CIA analyst and I studied other countries and I studied how their governments worked. And if I saw a new head of state fire the head of the FBI and the deputy head of the FBI and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chairman of the Naval Operations and the 3 JAG officers in charge of the 3 senior, the military services, and most of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, here's what I would write as an intelligence analyst. I would say, oh, that leader is purging the security forces in order to install loyalists who would obey his will. The way that Trump has installed loyalists and purged the top ranks of the military and federal law enforcement is within his rights as the president, and it's deeply, deeply worrying. This is the kind of thing that could be the groundwork for more explicit authoritarianism down the line.
Trump's coalition that you've already kind of alluded to continues to show signs of sometimes called the secular right, especially in areas of pro-life. Trump is essentially a soft pro-choice politician now, and the company he keeps. Elon Musk is self-described cultural Christian. Like, if anyone in the past, pre-2015, called themselves a cultural Christian and a Republican, they probably would have been marched out of the party. Why do evangelicals continue to support Trump along with his slide almost into areas that conservatives and Republicans in general have kind of deemed no-go zones?
I'll answer largely just thinking about my own experiences in evangelicalism and my many friends who are evangelical. The biggest thing is this preference of Trump over the alternatives. I think that's particularly true in this second election. In the first election, I think the hook was a Supreme Court that would overturn Roe v. Wade. And I think that's what got many people or many evangelicals supporting Trump, or allowed them to overlook what were even then potentially disqualifying.
I've heard said, and I will say again, that if Obama had 5 children by 3 different wives, he would have even never been a senator, let alone a president in 2008 or 2012.
Right. Something did change, in my view, in American evangelicalism in their relationship to their politicians, even just between 2012 and 2016. I had many friends who I remember, growing up, they were big Ron Paul fans, etc., who in 2012, I remember saying things like, it's wrong to support Mitt Romney because he's not a real Christian, because he's Mormon. And the gap from rejecting Mitt Romney because he's not a real evangelical to 4 years later, the same friends being the most enthusiastic Trump supporters. Personally, I find that bewildering. I'm not going to engage in too much armchair psychoanalysis about what happened to see that shift, but I do think in the first Trump administration, it was this promise of a right Supreme Court that would overturn Roe v. Wade. Voting for Trump in 2020, I think many people thought that the first Trump administration wasn't nearly as bad as everyone had warned. And by 2024, again, I think it comes down to pragmatism, to saying, well, he's better than Biden or better than Harris would have been. And now, I mean, even there's a sort of retconning of how evangelicals view political leaders. Again, the same ones who were fiercely critical of Bill Clinton for his moral failings, fiercely critical of other politicians, are now saying things like, Trump is a Cyrus, and he's maybe not righteous personally, but he's going to be a good leader. Yet fundamentally, I think it comes down to just preferring Trump for all of his faults over what they perceive to be the greater faults of, a potential Harris administration.
Holly, has Trump administration truly defied the courts? And if so, what specifically? What do you see as a possible realistic break it moment in that area for people who voted for him? Maybe not MAGA people, but I know plenty of people who've held their nose over the past 3 voting cycles and voted for Trump. What would be that break it moment? So has Trump defied the courts? If so, and if he hasn't, what would be a break it moment?
Yeah, so he has defied the courts. I don't know what a break it moment is. I mean, I see in the polling that there is not broad support for the president defying the courts, so there's obviously some play there. But honestly, I've frequently thought we've reached a break it moment with President Trump, and we've never actually done that yet. So Congress still is not standing up to him. I think people are waiting for the kind of apocryphal, President Jackson moment when he says John Marshall has made his law, now let him enforce it, and there's just like this broad, opposition. Jackson didn't say that, but we think about it. And I think we do a disservice to focus on that as the crisis point, because Trump has defied the courts in very meaningful ways. And we can think of a few examples. So we have the Supreme Court of the United States issuing an order saying that the Trump administration is to facilitate the return of Mr. Abrego Garcia, and that, of course, they say in their opinion, people subject to deportation under the Alien Enemies Act are entitled to notice and a hearing, to basic due process. So we have that coming from the Supreme Court themselves. And in reply, we have the Trump administration saying facilitate just means we don't get in the way. If they send him back, we'll send a plane. We'll let him come back in. We just don't bar it. And they also say due process doesn't mean much. They're in courts right now as litigation is pending saying, well, of course they got due process. We're here. When the ACLU had to, use an oxygen inhaler because they had to run to court so fast once they found out that, people are subject to deportation. So they're really playing fast and loose with some of these things, but also I think those are violations of the court order. I think of being a litigator myself, and I've been in court, and I've been instructed by a judge in so many words to, hey, I think we really need to hear from this other person, maybe the probation officer or something. You are to facilitate them and bring them into court. They don't say effectuate, because the probation officer could say, no, I'm not going, right? I can't drag that person into court physically, but I am to facilitate. I am to issue a subpoena. I am to reach out. I am to let them know what needs to happen. And if I came to court and said, oh, judge, I facilitated because I didn't stand in the door and block the way of the probation officer being here, and that's the sole, the sum of what I've done, I'd be held in contempt. That is not what I was asked to do. Nobody would think that's a reasonable interpretation of the court order. So that is, I think, a violation of the court order. We see a couple other just kind of, the Trump administration is sending their lawyers into court to argue these cases without giving them information to do it. And so that's kind of a mild contempt. So, lawyers are standing in front of these judges and saying, I don't know, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know, I don't have the answer to that. Or sometimes that might be classified, but I honestly don't know. And it's not how you litigate cases. That's not how you interact with courts and judges. And then there's also kind of the cute stuff like, oh, you only ordered DHS not to remove people under the Alien Enemies Act, and this was Department of Defense, so we actually didn't defy the court order. That's like telling a toddler not to run around the house, and then they ride their scooter around the house, and you didn't tell me I couldn't ride the scooter, you just said don't run, right? It's just too cute to be legitimate and to be respectful and to be upholding their oath to the Constitution and to the rule of law. So yes, I think they have defied the courts. And I think the more we can do to highlight for people for whom that is important, that the Trump administration not defy the courts, that this is happening and that they don't have to wait for the Jackson moment to realize that this is a threat to our courts and the rule of law. Even what we're seeing now would be a good thing.
So it sounds like more of a pile of defiling versus one break it moment. Do you, in your mind, could there be a singular break it moment as an example for maybe not, again, MAGA hard right, but people who ostentatiously voted for Trump but are still wary of him?
I don't know. I mean, I guess we could see a moment that is more like that Jackson moment where, there's not cute interpretations or, recreations or, executive privilege assertions, but actually like, no, this is your order and we're just not going to do it. And then I'd be curious to see what the reaction is. One of the problems with polling is when you identify an issue specifically, like, do you as a voter support the president defying the courts? The answer is no, they don't. But then when you look at the people who voted in 2024 for democracy as the first issue, that was way down on the list, right? So if they're still concerned about immigration and the economy, if those are still their primary concerns, is that actually going to change them to know that the president has defied the courts? I don't know. I hope so, because democracy was my number one voting issue in 2024. So I this is how I think, but I honestly don't know what that breaking point would be. And I imagine something like just a flat, no, we're not going to do it. We don't respect this court order, be the cleanest case of that.
Yeah, I think the economy more than anything else is going to be the make it or break it for Trump, whether we like it or not. And now a quick word from our sponsor. Dave and Tucker started D&T Mobile Detailing with one goal: deliver top quality car care you can count on. What began as a summer project has grown into a thriving business, thanks to the support of our amazing clients. They've built D&T on hard work, honest feedback, and serious attention to detail. They bring premium detailing straight to your driveway, convenient, reliable, and always done right. Experience the D&T difference. Book your appointment today. Contact available in the show notes. And now, back to the show. Matthew, issues like the border, the economy, size and shape of the federal government, issues over transgender rights, even hangovers for COVID restrictions are all broadly why Trump was able to get elected. Sorry, Holly, as you said, it was not democracy. Along with, I think also he got elected because he just had going up against two very weak opponents. You had Biden, who's never recovered in polling from his Afghan pullout, and then Harris always was polled pretty low as a vice president and then only had 100 days to get something together. Trump coming in had a high approval on his second term, and yet he seems to be doing these fixes by the most divisive way possible. Has Trump squandered a pretty big conservative opportunity?
Absolutely. And I want to start by pointing out what you just said about Trump facing two very weak opponents. I think there's been a tendency in the last several elections, actually, for whoever wins to massively overstate their mandate. It's one thing if you're FDR, Ronald Reagan in 1984. It's very easy under those conditions to say, like, you have a broad sort of national mandate to go full steam ahead on your entire agenda. That's not the case when you have a very narrow victory particularly a very narrow victory over a weak opponent. And I think in general, politicians need to be much more cautious and circumspect about these things to recognize if you won narrowly over a weak opponent, it's probably not because you have a massive mandate to support all of your policy preferences, but you have a narrow mandate where a lot of people want you to rule effectively and probably in predictable fashions where their lives won't radically change for the better or for the worse. But to kind of, as I suggested earlier, this is a conservative sentiment, to keep the ship upright and to keep water from pouring over the gunwales. And so I think Trump has massively overestimated his mandate here, and then has exacerbated this by the recklessness and the sort of disregard for policy process that we've seen. Then to make these particularly controversial, these particularly divisive cases, even where many people who want to see the Trump administration succeed are unhappy, to make those the centerpiece, I think is a colossal mistake. And I want to just focus on the immigration issue. something like 83% of Americans, 84% of Americans, when polled, say that they think that some people who are in the United States illegally ought to be deported. At least some. 30 something percent think that it should be everyone who's here illegally. There's a massive mandate to carry out some deportations of those who are here illegally. Let's take the subset of people who say some, not people who say everyone, but the 50% of Americans when polled, this is a Pew poll that came out last month, 51% say some. Of that 51%, it's nearly unanimous. We should deport people who are convicted of violent crimes. And so do the math, you have roughly 80% of Americans when polled are on board with the idea that if you're convicted of a violent crime, you should be deported. And you're here illegally, you should be deported. That's low-hanging fruit. If you want to carry out deportations, you're trying to pitch yourself as a law and order person. You're saying that illegal immigration is a huge crime problem. You have a mandate there. But instead, you're carrying out deportations in this sort of reckless and poorly considered way. You're generating a lot of concern, a lot of fear, a lot of chaos. You have people who, and many people who are otherwise sympathetic to that basic idea, abandoning their support for you. I just think that's a great example of how the Trump administration, for its like dispositional problems, is completely abandoning many really solid opportunities where they do have a mandate, where there are widely popular positions. I think the counterpoint to this is, the issue of transgender athletes in women's sports is also a very popular position, and the Trump administration has acted there. Americans are broadly supportive of Ukraine, to go back to something Paul said earlier. Americans, I think, are also broadly supportive of the idea that there are limits to how much foreign aid we should send, that maybe we don't want to get entangled excessively in Ukraine. And the Trump administration just seems dead set on, again, taking the most contrarian position. I've never won a presidential election, far less two of them. But sometimes I see the way the Trump administration behaves, and it seems like you want to lose votes and you want to lose support.
Yeah, he even said in his first interview after winning with MSNBC, like, I won on immigration and the price of eggs. I looked that up for this. That's a direct quote. And he seemed like tariffs, actually immigration, I think in general, at least border crossings, just by virtue of him being Trump and in the White House, has just dropped precipitously. I think last month was just 8,000 border crossings, which is like fundamentally insane, given an insane achievement, I think, given just we were dealing with under Biden. But yeah, he plays this game where he like obviously knows the bare essentials why he was elected, and then he just pushes as far out as he can go. And seemingly he's got a pretty no guardrails thing, because Congress can't do its job, apparently. But speaking of guardrails, Holly, overall, how are Trump 1.0 appointed judges ruling in Trump 2.0 lawsuits so far, if they have ruled? I ask for the similar reason of justices appointed to the Supreme Court. What are the guardrails, even by Trump judges, that are being put in place, if there are any?
Yeah, so far they've been holding up pretty well. We can walk through some examples here in a minute. But again, just kind of prefacing it with saying, we have an administration who says by presidential declaration, we are at war with a gang in Venezuela, and therefore we can deport people into prisons in El Salvador with no due process. For any judge to look at that and be like, yep, sounds good to me, would just be, unthinkable. So to a certain extent, the Trump administration is kind of, I don't want to say making it easy, it's hard in the courts, but like making the legal questions not entirely difficult in some of these cases. That said, I think to the extent that there's a difference between maybe some of the more conservative justices or judges and Trump appointees and others, Judge Trevor McFadden is a good example of maybe the difference in approach. I think you had him on the podcast, haven't you? There you go.
Very familial connections there, yeah.
All right, well, he stepped up, and I think he did a good job in this case. So he was assigned the case that involved the AP being cut out of the White House press pool because they refused to put Gulf of America in their international style book. He initially denied a temporary restraining order, which was an interesting move. You're like, well, it seems pretty unconstitutional, but he thought that there were some questions that needed to be briefed, and it wasn't an emergency, legally speaking. So he denied that, but then he heard briefing, and he heard arguments, took briefing, and he wrote a very thoughtful, long opinion, finding that this was absolutely unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination. The Trump administration changed their policies kind of more across the board in a way that wasn't super helpful to the AP and didn't restore the status quo. But he heard that and he said, well, at least this isn't viewpoint discrimination. Like, they do have a lot of discretion as to who they let into their press pool and how they rotate them through. And as long as they don't do it according to viewpoint discrimination or religious discrimination or racial discrimination or other legal categories, then the courts should defer to them. So that's kind of an example of a little more cautious, restrained, deferential approach to this. Largely, you see like Judge Walker in the DC Circuit, he heard the appeal of Judge Vradenburgh's ruling that the Trump administration could not deport people under the Alien Enemies Act. There was, from the other judges on that panel, this just kind of incredulous, I can't believe you're doing this. This is so illegal. And he really focused on the whole question of whether this lawsuit needed to be brought in habeas versus, under the APA, and whether we were in the right court. Ultimately, the Supreme Court, the majority agreed with him. So he was, thinking legally. At the same time, it was, you didn't hear from him, at least initially, just that incredulous, like, this is really illegal. And also this is an interesting threshold jurisdictional question. But you have Judge Rodriguez in the Southern District of Texas has enjoined removals under the Alien Enemies Act. He's a Trump appointee. You have a Judge Friedrich, has enjoined the Dear Colleague Department of Education guidance, withholding funding for educational institutions that engage in DEI, finding that at this point, the definition of DEI is unconstitutionally vague. What do they mean? What kind of clear guidance are they giving these funding recipients? And then at the level of the Supreme Court, and this is, true before Trump 2.0, but I think it's fair to say that if you had to put all the justices in the ideological, left to right spectrum, that the Trump appointees are not the most conservative or are not the most loyal to Trump. They're very conservative, but the kind of extreme end would be Justices Thomas and Alito, who are not Trump appointees. So overall, they've been holding up pretty well with these cases, and we'll just continue to monitor them as maybe some more difficult questions arise down the road.
Has Trump broken full trust with our allies, especially those in Western and developed nations? And if so, what would be the landscape for our allies, if we have any, after Trump 2.0, whether that's Vance or an AOC presidency or something? What do we have any allies-ish left? And if so, what's the chance of rebuilding those?
So the NATO treaty remains in effect. We have not formally withdrawn or abrogated it. That doesn't mean a whole lot if Trump simply refuses to enforce it or give an order to the military to take an action that the NATO treaty would require. I would love people to imagine, their middle school playground. NATO is when all the kids in the playground get together to face down the bully. If they don't, then the bully runs the schoolyard. He picks them off one by one. The bully gets his own gang. And the culture of the schoolyard is run by the worst of the worst. It's like if Hogwarts was run by Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle, right? NATO is when Harry and Ron and Hermione get together and rally the rest of the school. So the school is run by the people with courage and integrity and honor.
What I'm hearing is NATO should be renamed as Dumbledore's Army.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. Now the problem is that in this situation, it's not just simply that, let's say, that Harry has gone absent. It's that he's joined Malfoy. Harry said, that Malfoy guy, he's got a point. That's what's happened when Trump in the Oval Office berated the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, and he essentially echoed Russian talking points about the war. That's what's going on right now. Again, we haven't formally abrogated the NATO treaty, but the president of the United States agrees with the president of Russia more than he agrees with the prime minister of the United Kingdom or the president of France or the chancellor of Germany. That's the sense in which we've broken faith with our allies. We Trump has said that America views the world the same way that Russia does. And so all allies around the world are on notice that America is perceiving things differently, interpreting threats differently.
I mean,
And
Pete Hegseth basically said that in Germany,
yeah,
right?
and,
Like,
yeah.
we're not coming anymore.
And I think that Europe will try to hang together on their own without American leadership. And that's good because they will sustain a corner of the free world for themselves. Although I doubt their ability to really to win the war in Ukraine by themselves. I don't think they can. And so your question is, what happens now? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. It's not as if America is isolationist in the 20s and 30s. It's actually a little bit worse than that. We are active and engaged in a nationalist direction, actively joining Russia. And that's never happened before in history. So I don't know exactly how this is going to play out. I don't know that it's sustainable. I don't know that it will outlast Trump personally. I'm not even sure JD Vance will continue this. But for the next few years, I think all bets are off, and I think it's highly unpredictable what kind of world we're going to be living in.
Yeah, I kind of, in my very low level stake, I kind of just almost feel the world holding its breath, being like, okay, let's just batten down the hatches. We'll see America in 3.5 years.
And if I'm Xi Jinping and I'm looking at the situation, I'm not going to I'm not going to poke America now. I'm going to fight a trade war with them, but I'm actually pretty happy with the sort of world order that Donald Trump is helping to create. Donald Trump is helping to create a great power, spheres of influence kind of world. That's actually exactly what China and Russia both want. And so if I'm China, I'm going to kind of hold my time. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to choose my time to stake my claim to my sphere of influence. And that time is 2028, when America is distracted by our next presidential election, when Trump is a lame duck, when Trump is on his way out, but before the next person takes power, the Chinese will try to create facts on the ground that cannot be changed by the next administration. That's what Russia's tried to do in Ukraine, and China is going to try to do that in Taiwan in 2028. I'm making a very firm prediction here. I think that there's going to be a crisis in the Taiwan Straits in 2028, and I think that Trump is ill-equipped to handle that.
You want to take a month? It sounds lame duck, so maybe November or December there might be a crisis in 2028, or do you want to just stick with the year?
Probably earlier in the year when the weather's nicer, honestly. So,
yeah. Very fair. All, thank you for joining. We'll do a quick outro. What are some ways you see as foreseeable concerns in the next 100 days and even beyond?
So I'm obviously keeping an eye on everything that concerns us and that we've talked about. The container ships not coming to the U.S. and what that's going to mean here for some supplies and prices and the stock market and Ukraine. But again, as a lawyer, I'll kind of focus in on the legal issues that I've got my eye on. One is kind of an interplay of a few things we've talked about already. Department of Justice is being gutted of career lawyers. They're either leaving on their own or being fired, or Doge is coming in. I'm not quite sure what's happening, but we're just seeing a big exodus of career attorneys in the Department of Justice and the Solicitor General's office. And we also see that it's a really difficult job right now, so it's not that attractive for lawyers coming in. They're not being given good information with which to go to court. There are some loyalty tests, and it's just, for a lot of lawyers, this would be a very concerning time to join the Department of Justice. So we're seeing the Trump administration kind of interpret some of these agreements that it's made with law firms, that it's targeted with executive orders, to say that they have kind of this army of lawyers that they can assign for pro bono services. There's a recent executive order about police officers that are sued, and how it is going to be the policy of the Department of Justice to make sure that they all have free legal representation. Lawyers are leaving the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division. I'm guessing that they're going to want to reach out to some of these law firms and say, here are your pro bono cases that you committed to. And I'm also guessing that the law firms may take some of them, or may say, no, we didn't agree to take assigned cases. We just agreed to take cases in general that helped veterans or these certain type of areas. So I'm curious to see how that kind of plays out, because it's going to be hard to sustain the level of litigation and activity that we currently see when the lawyers representing the government are exiting, as we see them.
What are we concerned about in the next 100 days? The shorter list is, what are we not concerned about? Look, I mean, everything we've talked about for the past hour is areas for concern. Yes, I'm concerned about a confrontation between Trump and the courts. I'm concerned about the state of the world. I'm concerned about the state of the world economy. It's harder to measure, but I think I'm most concerned about the state of American political culture. There's continuing polarization on both sides, continuing extremism on both sides. And I do want to say both sides. Someday we'll live in a post-Trump era, and in that era, the left will give us the left-wing version of all this. But they also will challenge the courts. They also will abuse executive orders, and they'll do it in their direction because Trump has set the precedent for this. And I'm deeply concerned about the long-term effects that this is going to have on American culture, American history. And I'm concerned about the normalization. I think if you're under the age of, I don't know, 30, this is all normal to you, and you've never known anything else. And my heart breaks for that because I'm just old enough to remember that this isn't normal. This isn't what normal was. And I would love to fight against the sense that this is both normal and inevitable. It's not. It's a choice. And we can choose otherwise. We can build a different kind of world and a different kind of politics. So don't give in to the despair. I know it comes out in my voice sometimes that I sound that way, but I'm fighting for hope, but I'm fighting to build the world that I remember. I hope it's not just rose-colored glasses, that there was a world that wasn't like this in the not too recent past, and we can build that again. So I'm concerned that we're going to lose that sense.
Yeah, I'm really hoping the Virginia election, which Matthew, I know you won't be a part of, but the Virginia gubernatorial election will be probably with two women, Abigail Spanberger for the Democrats and our lieutenant governor for the Republicans. And I see kind of a Trumpy female versus a much more moderate Democrat. And I'm hoping maybe we can get back to a moderate regular Democrat versus regular Republican, and maybe that could start the tide. I don't actually see that, but one can hope.
I want to echo what Paul said about normalization. You got me in the last 3 days before I turned 30. And so, yeah, that means I have never voted in a presidential election in which Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot. I have a classroom full of students in my intro to political theory class who were born in 2007. I'm asking these questions about rhetoric as we read the Gorgias, or about virtue among leaders. And there's a sense in which their entire world of politics is this era with Donald Trump. And I think, yeah, many of them see the confrontation, the polarization, and the recklessness is just that's how politics is, or how I worry about that getting worse. I think regularly about my students 3 years from now, who will be born in 2010. And if they will have any reason or any inkling of the fact that you could have a different approach to politics. More concretely, I would say due process and rule of law. And that's the fundamental question. It's not, to me, a question of whether conservatives are in charge or liberals or progressives. You know, Aristotle tells us that we need to learn how to rule and be ruled in turn. But you can't have that system of being ruled and ruling in turn without the rule of law, without due process. That's the thing that preserves this idea that when you lose an election, you can be the faithful opposition and you'll get your shot again sometime in the future under fair rules that apply equally to everyone. And that's always been one of my greatest concerns with Trump. And I'd say the last 100 days have not made me more optimistic.
Thank you so much, everyone. And for anyone listening, we'll be back next week on Church Coffee. Thank you, everybody. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.